It was a factory of death, efficient and absolute. The boy they dragged from the cattle car was just another piece of kindling, skin stretched over bone, eyes hollowed out by starvation. But when a guard struck him, the boy looked up, and with a voice as cold and clear as winter ice, spoke in a German more pure than the guard had ever heard. In that moment, the factory stopped. The morning roll call at Gross Rosen concentration camp began, as it always did, with the sound of boots on gravel and the sharp crack of commands echoing across the parade ground. 5,000 skeletal figures stood in perfect rows, their striped uniforms hanging like shrouds on frames that had once been human beings. The autumn air carried the acrid smell of smoke from the crematoria, a constant reminder that in this place, death was not a tragedy, but a schedule to be maintained. Obersturmbannführer Ernst Brand stood on the platform overlooking the assembly, his uniform immaculate, his bearing that of a man who had learned to find order in chaos. At 52, he possessed the weary efficiency of a career bureaucrat who had discovered that the most terrible things could be accomplished through proper paperwork and methodical routine. His pale eyes swept across the sea of prisoners with the dispassionate assessment of a clerk counting inventory. "Block leaders, report," Brandt commanded, his voice carrying easily across the silent ranks. The numbers were called out in monotone efficiency. Block 1, 347 present, 12 dead overnight. Block 2, 289 present, 82 sick to stand. Block 3, 201 present, 15 sent to selection yesterday. The arithmetic of atrocity, calculated and documented with Germanic thoroughness. From his position in Block 7, Dr. Samuel Abramovich listened to the familiar ritual with the detached horror of a man who had witnessed too much to feel shock anymore. At 63, the former professor of medicine from Prague had become something he never thought possible. A survivor not through strength or cunning, but through the simple, bitter necessity of being useful. The camp needed someone to tend the sick just enough to keep them working until they died. It was a devil's bargain, but it allowed him to occasionally save a life, to preserve some fragment of his oath to do no harm. The roll call was interrupted by the distant whistle of an approaching train. Another transport, another shipment of human cargo to feed the insatiable appetite of the Reich's final solution. Brandt checked his watch with the practiced irritation of a man whose schedule was being disrupted. "Process the new arrivals," he ordered his aide, a nervous Unterscharführer named Kellner. "Standard procedure, selection, delousing, assignment to barracks. I want it completed before noon." The cattle cars came to a halt with the screech of metal on metal, steam hissing from the locomotive like the breath of some mechanical beast. The doors were yanked open by guards who had performed this ritual hundreds of times, revealing the human wreckage within. Men, women, and children packed so tightly that many had died standing up during the journey from the ghettos of Poland. "Out! Everyone out! Move! Schnell!" The commands were barked in German, reinforced by rifle butts and snarling dogs. The survivors stumbled from the cars, blinking in the harsh sunlight, their faces wearing the universal expression of people who had abandoned hope, but not yet surrendered to death. Among them was a boy who appeared to be perhaps 12 years old, though starvation had made age difficult to determine. His ash-blonde hair was matted with filth, his gray eyes enormous in a face that was little more than skin stretched over bone. He wore the remnants of what might once have been good clothing, now reduced to rags that hung on his skeletal frame like a scarecrow's costume. Unterscharführer Otto Krieger, a thick-necked brute from Bavaria who had found his calling in the camps, shoved the boy forward with casual violence. "Move, Polish filth! You're not in your village anymore!" The boy stumbled, his legs too weak to maintain balance, and fell face first into the mud that was mixed with ash and things no human should have to contemplate. Krieger laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "Look at this one!" he called out to his companions. "Probably noble blood, eh? Maybe a little prince from Warsaw." He kicked the boy in the ribs, not hard enough to break bones. That would interfere with processing, but enough to cause pain. "Get up, your majesty! Time for your royal welcome to the Reich." The boy pushed himself to his hands and knees, mud dripping from his face. For a moment he remained perfectly still, as if gathering something from deep within himself. Then he raised his head and looked directly at Krieger with eyes that seemed far older than his years. When he spoke, his voice was clear and precise, each word articulated with the crisp perfection of aristocratic breeding. But more shocking than the clarity was the language itself. Not Polish, not the broken German of the occupied territories, but High German spoken with an accent so pure it could have graced the salons of Berlin's finest districts. One should not speak the language of Goethe and Schiller with the tongue of a pig. The words fell into the chaos of the arrival like stones into still water, creating ripples of absolute silence that spread outward until even the snarling dogs seemed to pause. Krieger's mouth fell open, his next curse dying unspoken. The other guards stopped their shouting, their heads turning toward the source of this impossible sound. In the sudden quiet, the boy continued to kneel in the mud, but something fundamental had changed. His posture, while still that of a starving child, now carried an indefinable quality of dignity that seemed to transform the filth around him into something else entirely. "What did you say?" Krieger whispered, his voice containing a note that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. The boy remained silent, but his gray eyes held the guard's gaze with steady defiance. Around them, the processing of other prisoners had ground to a halt as a word of the incident spread through the ranks. Whispers in German, Polish, and Yiddish created a susurrus of amazement and confusion. Dr. Abramovich, who had been assigned to the medical inspection of new arrivals, pushed through the crowd of prisoners to get a better look. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat, not just the boy's obvious intelligence and courage, but something in his bearing that spoke of education, of privilege, of a world that existed before the descent into madness. From the platform, Brandt had observed the disturbance through his field glasses. He lowered them slowly, his analytical mind already working through the implications of what he had witnessed. In 3 years of commanding Gross Rosen, he had processed thousands of prisoners. He had seen every possible variation of human degradation and desperation. But this was something new. "Bring the boy to my office," he ordered Kellner. Immediately, Krieger, still shaken by the encounter, yanked the boy to his feet with unnecessary force. But even as he was dragged away, the boy maintained that same quiet dignity, his head held high despite his circumstances. The walk to the commandant's office was a journey between worlds, from the chaos and brutality of the arrival platform to the sterile efficiency of the administrative building. Here, the Holocaust was managed with the same methodical precision that might be applied to any other industrial process. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their contents documenting the systematic destruction of human lives with bureaucratic thoroughness. Brandt's office was a study in contradictions. Beautiful mahogany furniture looted from the homes of the dead, first edition books that would never again be read by their original owners. And on the wall, a portrait of the Führer watching over it all with painted eyes that seemed to follow every movement. The commandant sat behind his desk, studying the boy who stood dripping mud into his Persian carpet. Up close, the child's condition was even more shocking. Every rib visible through his torn shirt, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, arms so thin they seemed barely capable of supporting their own weight. And yet there was something unbroken in his posture, something that suggested reserves of strength that had nothing to do with physical condition. "Sit!" Brandt commanded, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. The boy remained standing, his gray eyes meeting the commandant's pale ones without flinching. "I said sit." "I prefer to stand," the boy replied in that same perfect German, his voice steady despite his obvious exhaustion. Brandt leaned back in his chair, genuinely intrigued. In his experience, new arrivals fell into predictable categories: the terrified, the defiant, the broken. But this child was something else entirely, a puzzle that demanded solving. "What is your name?" "I don't remember." "Your age?" "I don't remember." "Where are you from?" "I don't remember." Brandt smiled thinly. "Your memory seems remarkably selective. You remember how to speak German like a Berlin aristocrat, but you've forgotten your own name?" The boy said nothing, but something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but calculation. He was thinking, weighing options, playing some game whose rules only he understood. "Let me tell you what I think," Brandt continued, rising from his chair and walking around the desk to stand directly in front of the boy. "I think you're not Polish at all. I think you're German, probably from a good family. I think you have a story that would be very interesting to hear, and I think you're going to tell me that story one way or another." The boy's silence stretched between them like a drawn blade. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember only that I am here now. Nothing before this moment exists. Brandt studied him for a long moment, then returned to his desk. Very well, we'll see how long your amnesia lasts. Guards? Two SS men entered immediately. Take this one to Block 12. General population, standard rations, standard work assignment. Let's see if a few weeks of reality can restore his memory. As the guards prepared to escort him out, the boy turned back to face Brandt. For just an instant, his mask of childish confusion slipped, revealing something harder underneath. Intelligence, yes, but also a kind of cold fury that was startling in someone so young. Commandant, he said quietly, you should know that some things, once broken, can never be repaired. But some things are stronger than they appear. Then the mask returned, and he was once again just a starving child being led away to probable death. Brandt stared at the closed door for a long time after they left, his mind turning over the encounter like a puzzle box whose solution remained tantalizingly out of reach. In his desk drawer lay files on thousands of prisoners, their crimes, their backgrounds, their expected survival times calculated with actuarial precision. But this boy was different. This boy was a mystery that would require special attention. Outside, the smoke from the crematoria continued to rise into the gray autumn sky, indifferent to one more mystery in a place where mysteries usually died with their keepers. Block 12 was a monument to human suffering, a wooden barracks that housed 300 men in a space designed for 50. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and despair, so concentrated it seemed to have physical weight. Wooden bunks stacked 3 high lined the walls, each shared by 4 or more prisoners, who took turns sleeping when exhaustion finally overcame the discomfort of lying on bare boards. When the guards shoved the boy through the door, conversation stopped as 300 pairs of eyes assessed the newcomer. In Gross Rosen, survival often depended on quickly determining who might be an ally, who represented a threat, and who was likely to die so quickly they weren't worth knowing. The boy, Lucas, though he would not speak that name aloud, stood in the doorway with the same quiet dignity he had maintained in the commandant's office. His gray eyes swept the barracks with the assessment of someone who had learned to read danger in subtle signs. "Another one for the grinder," muttered a skeletal man near the door, his voice carrying the flat acceptance of someone who had seen too many arrivals to waste emotion on them. "He won't last a week," agreed his bunkmate. "Look at him, already half dead. First work detail will finish him." But from the back of the barracks came a different voice, one that carried the authority of education and experience. "Make room on bunk 7. The boy goes there." Dr. Abramovich emerged from the shadows like a guardian angel dressed in stripes. In the barracks, he was more than just the camp medic. He was confessor, counselor, and sometimes the only thing standing between a prisoner and absolute despair. "Come," he said to Lucas, his voice gentle but firm. "You look ready to collapse." Lucas followed the doctor to a bunk in the middle of the barracks, where several men shifted to make space. Up close, Dr. Abramovich was a study in contradictions. His body bore all the signs of prolonged starvation, but his eyes remained alert and compassionate, refusing to surrender to the dehumanization that surrounded them. "Lie down," the doctor instructed. "Rest while you can. Tomorrow the real test begins." As Lucas settled onto the hardboards, Dr. Abramovich leaned close and whispered in German so softly that only the boy could hear. "I heard what happened at the platform. That was either very brave or very foolish." "Perhaps both," Lucas replied in the same whisper. "Your German is remarkable for a Polish boy." Lucas met the doctor's eyes. "So is yours for a Jewish professor." The doctor smiled despite himself. "Touché. What's your real name, son?" For a moment, Lucas was silent. Then so quietly the words were barely breath, he said, "Lucas von Stauffen. My father was Ambassador Karl von Stauffen." Dr. Abramovich's eyes widened in recognition. The name von Stauffen had been in the newspapers just over a year ago, a high-ranking diplomat executed for treason, part of a conspiracy that had sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the Reich. "Dear God," the doctor whispered, "you're supposed to be dead." "Everyone I was supposed to be is dead," Lucas replied. "I'm just trying to decide who I am now." That night, as 300 men tried to find rest in conditions that would have been cruel for animals, Dr. Abramovich lay awake thinking about the boy beside him, the son of Karl von Stauffen, a name that had been whispered in resistance circles, a man who had tried to save his country from the madness that had consumed it. If the boy had survived, if he was truly who he claimed to be, then he carried secrets that could topple governments. But secrets, Dr. Abramovich knew, were dangerous things in a place like Gross Rosen. They could be weapons, but they could also be death sentences. The next morning brought the harsh reality of camp life. At 4:30 a.m., the barracks erupted with shouts and the sound of clubs against wood as guards roused the prisoners for another day of slave labor. The sick and the dying were dragged from their bunks regardless of their condition. In Gross Rosen, only death excused a man from work. Lucas was assigned to the stone quarry, back-breaking labor that broke strong men within weeks. The work involved hauling blocks of granite from the pit to waiting trucks, a Sisyphean task that served no purpose beyond the systematic destruction of human spirit and body. Under the October sun, Lucas labored alongside men who had once been teachers, merchants, fathers, and sons. Now they were simply numbers, their humanity reduced to the calories they could burn before their bodies gave out entirely. The boy's aristocratic education had included languages, literature, and diplomatic protocol, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of lifting stones that weighed more than he did. By midday, his hands were bleeding, his back screamed with pain, and his vision blurred with exhaustion. But he continued working, driven by something deeper than physical strength, the memory of his father's final words, the weight of the secrets he carried, the knowledge that surrender meant more than just his own death. "Boy!" The shout came from Unterscharführer Kellner, Brandt's nervous aide, who had been assigned to observe the new prisoner. "You, the smart mouth from yesterday!" Lucas straightened slowly, his gray eyes meeting the guard's gaze with steady defiance despite his obvious exhaustion. "Commandant wants to see you, now." The walk back to the administrative building was a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Word had spread through the camp about the boy who spoke perfect German, and speculation ran wild about his true identity. Some thought he was a German spy. Others believed he was nobility in disguise. All agreed that he was something unusual in a place where the unusual rarely survived long. Brandt was waiting in his office, lunch spread before him on fine china that contrasted obscenely with the starvation visible through his window. He gestured for Lucas to sit, then continued eating as if the boy's presence was of no particular importance. "How was your first day?" he asked conversationally. "Educational," Lucas replied, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Good. Learning is important. For instance, I've been learning about you." Brandt consulted a file on his desk. No records of a boy matching your description reported missing from any of the Polish territories. No family members searching for a lost child. It's almost as if you never existed at all. Lucas remained silent, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Of course," Brandt continued, "there are other possibilities. Perhaps you're not Polish at all. Perhaps you're German from a family that's fallen from grace. Perhaps your amnesia is quite selective indeed." "I remember only what I choose to remember," Lucas said quietly. "Interesting phrasing. What do you choose to remember?" "I remember that I'm hungry. I remember that I'm tired. I remember that some people find pleasure in the suffering of others." Lucas met Brandt's eyes directly. "And I remember that such people usually end badly." Brandt set down his fork, genuinely intrigued by the boy's combination of vulnerability and defiance. "You're very wise for someone so young, but wisdom without power is just another form of weakness. My father once told me that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who have nothing left to lose." "Your father? I thought you didn't remember anything." Lucas realized his mistake immediately, but his expression didn't change. "I remember fragments, pieces of conversation, like voices from a dream." Brandt leaned forward, sensing weakness. "What else did this dream father tell you?" "That truth is more powerful than lies, but much more dangerous to speak." The commandant studied the boy for a long moment, his analytical mind working through possibilities. The child was clearly more than he appeared to be, but extracting his secrets would require patience and subtlety. "Return to your work," Brandt said finally. "We'll speak again soon." As Lucas was escorted back to the quarry, Brandt opened a different file, one containing reports from Berlin about ongoing investigations into the von Stauffen conspiracy. The ambassador's son had never been found, presumed dead in the same purge that had claimed his parents. But if the boy had somehow survived, if he had been hiding in occupied Poland, the implications were staggering. The von Stauffen network had included industrialists, generals, even members of the SS itself. If the boy had knowledge of his father's associates, If he carried names and details that could expose the conspiracy's full extent. Brandt reached for his telephone, then stopped. Such a call would have to be made carefully, through the proper channels. Too much attention from Berlin could be as dangerous as too little. For now, he would watch and wait, letting the boy's suffering soften him for the real interrogation to come. In the quarry, Lucas continued his labor as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. But his mind was elsewhere, calculating possibilities, remembering lessons his father had taught him about the delicate balance between revelation and concealment. He was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between maintaining his cover and protecting the secrets that could bring down some of the most powerful men in the Reich. One misstep would mean death, not just for him, but potentially for others whose names he carried in his memory like sacred trust. But he was his father's son, trained in the subtle arts of diplomacy and deception. And in this place of absolute horror, those skills might be the only things that could save not just his life, but his soul. The game had begun in earnest. 3 weeks passed in the grinding rhythm of camp life. Dawn roll call, brutal labor, watery soup, and the constant presence of death. Lucas's body adapted with the resilience of youth, though he remained painfully thin. More importantly, he learned the unwritten rules that govern survival in Gross Rosen. Dr. Abramovich became his guide through this landscape of calculated horror. The elderly physician shared precious scraps of bread saved from his own meager rations, taught him which guards could be reasoned with and which were pure sadists, and most crucially, showed him how to become invisible when invisibility meant survival. The key, the doctor explained one evening as they huddled in their bunk, is to be useful but not indispensable, present but not memorable. The moment you become either too valuable or too troublesome, you die. But Lucas knew his situation was more complex than simple survival. Every few days, he was summoned to Brandt's office for what the commandant called conversations, psychological probing disguised as casual chat. Each session was a delicate dance where Lucas had to reveal just enough to maintain Brandt's interest while concealing the explosive truth of his identity. "Your German continues to impress me," Brandt observed during one such meeting, offering the boy a piece of real bread, a luxury that represented more calories than Lucas usually saw in 2 days. Such precision, such vocabulary. Where does a Polish orphan learn to speak like a Berlin aristocrat? Lucas accepted the bread gratefully, eating it slowly to make it last. Language is like music. Some people have an ear for it. "Indeed. And what other talents do you possess?" "I can read and write. I know some mathematics, a little history." Whose history? The question was loaded with implication. In the Reich, there was German history and the distorted propaganda that served its interests. And then there was everything else, the perspective of the conquered, the testimony of the victims. "The history of kings and kingdoms," Lucas replied carefully. "Stories of rise and fall, of how the mighty become dust." Brandt smiled thinly. A philosophical child. How unusual. These sessions continued with increasing frequency, each one a test that Lucas had to pass without revealing too much. Brandt was clearly convinced that the boy was more than he appeared, but he hadn't yet found the key to unlock his secrets. Meanwhile, life in Block 12 continued its harsh routine. Men died regularly, from exhaustion, disease, execution, or simple despair. New arrivals replaced them with mechanical regularity, and the process continued. Dr. Abramovich did what he could to ease suffering, but his resources were limited to compassion and the few medical supplies he could scavenge or steal. It was during one of these grim October nights that everything changed. The evening roll call had ended with the usual tally of the dead and dying. Prisoners shuffled back to their barracks under the watchful eyes of guards who seemed to enjoy the psychological weight of their absolute power. Dr. Abramovich was making his rounds, checking on the sick with the dedication of a man who refused to let his humanity be erased by his circumstances. He had just finished examining a young Polish farmer who was dying of pneumonia when Unterscharführer Kellner burst into the barracks with unusual urgency. "The Jew doctor!" he shouted. "Where is the Jew doctor?" Dr. Abramovich stepped forward with the calm dignity he maintained even in the face of obvious danger. "I am here. Come, now, commandant's orders." As the doctor was dragged away, Lucas felt something cold settle in his stomach. In Gross Rosen, sudden summons rarely ended well, especially for someone whose only protection was his usefulness as a healer. The next morning brought confirmation of his worst fears. At roll call, Brandt stood before the assembled prisoners with an expression of cold satisfaction. Behind him, a makeshift gallows had been erected in the center of the parade ground. Yesterday, Brandt announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent ranks, we discovered evidence of sabotage in the medical supplies. Drugs and bandages stolen, medicine diverted from its proper use. The investigation has revealed the guilty party. Dr. Abramovich was led onto the platform, his hands bound behind his back, his face bearing the marks of an interrogation that had lasted through the night. But his eyes remained clear and defiant, meeting the stares of the prisoners with the steady gaze of a man who had chosen his fate. Dr. Samuel Abramovich, Brandt continued, formerly of Prague, has been found guilty of theft and sabotage of Reich property. The sentence is death, to be carried out immediately as an example to all who would think to defy German justice. Lucas stood frozen in ranks, his mind racing through possibilities. This was no coincidence. Brandt was applying pressure, trying to force an emotional response that would reveal the boy's true nature. The commandant's pale eyes swept the crowd, searching for any sign of unusual reaction. As the noose was placed around Dr. Abramovich's neck, the elderly physician's eyes found Lucas in the crowd. For just a moment, their gazes met, and in that connection, Lucas saw not fear, but a kind of peaceful resolution. The doctor had made his choice. He would die as he had lived, trying to ease suffering even if it cost him everything. The silence stretched across the parade ground like a taut wire. 5,000 prisoners held their breath, understanding that they were witnessing not just an execution, but a test of their own humanity. How many would watch a good man die and do nothing? How many would remain silent to preserve their own lives? Lucas felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him like a physical force. Karl von Stauffen had died because he could not stand by while his country committed atrocities. His mother had died because she chose love over safety, and now Dr. Abramovich was about to die because he had shown kindness to a boy whose secrets could topple governments. The executioner reached for the lever that would open the trapdoor. In seconds, the only man who had shown Lucas human kindness in this place of horror would be dead. Time seemed to slow as Lucas made his choice. Stop! The word rang across the parade ground with crystal clarity, spoken in that same perfect German that had first marked him as different. 5,000 heads turned toward the sound, and Brandt's eyes found him immediately, bright with triumph and anticipation. Lucas stepped forward from the ranks, his gray eyes fixed on the commandant with unwavering intensity. As he walked across the open ground, every eye followed his progress, guards reaching for weapons, prisoners holding their breath, Brandt leaning forward with predatory interest. When he reached the platform, Lucas stopped and looked up at the commandant with the bearing of someone who had suddenly remembered exactly who he was. "Commandant Brandt," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "My name is Lucas von Stauffen. My father was Ambassador Karl von Stauffen, executed for treason in Berlin last year." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled prisoners. Even the guards seemed momentarily stunned by this revelation. "Before you hang that man," Lucas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "you should know that my father entrusted me with certain information before his death: names, dates, financial records, a complete list of his co-conspirators in the plot against the Reich." Brandt's face had gone pale, but his eyes burned with fierce interest. "What kind of information?" "The kind that includes Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Hausbach of the Procurement Division. I believe he has been quite generous in his contracts with this camp's construction projects." Lucas let the name hang in the air like a sword over Brandt's head. "I imagine he would be very interested to know what happened to the son of his fallen friend." The silence that followed was absolute. Brandt stood frozen, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just heard. Hausbach was indeed one of the most powerful men in the SS procurement system, with connections that reached to the highest levels of the Reich. If this boy truly knew details of the von Stauffen conspiracy, if he could expose Hausbach's involvement— "Halt the execution," Brandt commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. The executioner stepped back from the lever, confusion evident on his face. Dr. Abramovich remained standing on the trapdoor, the noose still around his neck. But his eyes now showed a different kind of surprise, not at his reprieve, but at the courage of the boy who had risked everything to save him. "Release the prisoner," Brandt ordered. "Return him to the infirmary and bring the boy to my office immediately. As Dr. Abramovich was led away, his life suddenly and inexplicably spared, Lucas allowed himself to be escorted toward the administrative building. He had played his most dangerous card, revealed a secret that could either save them both or destroy them all. But as he walked away from the gallows, he carried with him the memory of Dr. Abramovich's eyes, grateful, proud, and most importantly, still alive. The game had reached its crucial moment, and Lucas von Stauffen was no longer just surviving. He was fighting back. The walk to Brandt's office felt like a procession to judgment. Every step carried Lucas further from the relative anonymity of the prison blocks toward a confrontation that would determine not just his fate, but potentially the survival of everyone connected to his father's conspiracy. Behind him, the parade ground buzzed with whispered conversations, as 5,000 prisoners tried to process what they had witnessed. The starving boy who had seemed destined for quick death had just revealed himself as the son of one of the Reich's most notorious traitors. In Gross Rosen, where hope was a luxury few could afford, the moment felt like a crack in the foundation of absolute despair. Brandt's office had been transformed into an interrogation chamber. The Persian rugs had been rolled away, the comfortable chairs replaced with a single wooden stool facing the commandant's desk. Two SS guards flanked the door, their hands resting on their sidearms with practiced readiness. "Sit," Brandt commanded, his earlier conversational manner replaced by the cold efficiency of a man conducting serious business. Lucas took his place on the stool, his gray eyes meeting the commandant's pale gaze without flinching. He had crossed the line from careful survival to open defiance, and there was no path back to anonymity. "You have my attention," Brandt said, settling behind his desk like a judge preparing to render verdict. "But attention is a dangerous thing to have in this place. I trust you understand the weight of the claims you've made." "I understand that Dr. Abramovich is alive because of those claims," Lucas replied. "That was my immediate objective." "Your immediate objective?" Brandt leaned forward, genuinely intrigued by the boy's phrasing. "And your long-term objectives?" "Survival, for myself and those I care about." How refreshingly honest. "Now let's discuss the details of this remarkable inheritance your father left you. Names, you said, financial records, the inner workings of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the Reich." Lucas remained silent for a long moment, his mind calculating the delicate balance between revelation and preservation. Too little information would make him worthless. Too much would make him too dangerous to keep alive. "My father was careful," he said finally. "He knew that his activities would eventually be discovered. He prepared for that eventuality by creating insurance." "What kind of insurance?" "The kind that ensures powerful men remain invested in the survival of those who might otherwise be inconvenient." Brandt's smile was sharp as broken glass. "You speak like a diplomat's son, but I need specifics, not philosophical observations." Lucas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him. Oberfuhrer Hausbach provided funding for resistance activities through inflated construction contracts. The excess payments were funneled to safe houses and escape routes for targeted individuals. My father kept detailed records of every transaction. The commandant's face had gone ashen. If such records existed, if they fell into the wrong hands during the Reich's increasingly desperate final phase, men like Hausbach would face execution as traitors. "Where are these records?" "Safe, hidden where only I can retrieve them." "You're lying. A child couldn't maintain such a secret for over a year." Lucas's expression didn't change. "My father trained me from childhood to remember. Names, dates, numbers, conversations. He said a diplomat's son must have a perfect memory because sometimes memory is the only thing that stands between survival and destruction." "Prove it." Hausbach, Wilhelm, born Dusseldorf, 1889, promoted to Oberfuhrer, March 1942. Wife, Greta, maiden name Kellerman. Two sons, Hans and Friedrich, both serving on the Eastern Front. Bank account at Deutsche Bank Berlin. Account number 7,429,851,331. Payments to my father's network totaling 2.3 million Reichsmarks between January 1943 and August 1944. Brandt stared at the boy in stunned silence. The level of detail was impossible to fabricate. Bank account numbers, family information, precise financial figures. Either the child was an extraordinary liar, or he truly was the walking repository of secrets that could destroy some of the most powerful men in the Reich. There are others, Lucas continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Industrialists who diverted materials to resistance cells, officers who provided intelligence to my father's network, men whose careers and lives depend on certain information never becoming public. The commandant's mind raced through implications. If the boy was telling the truth, he was sitting across from a weapon of unimaginable political value. But weapons could cut both ways. Those same powerful men would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure their secrets remain buried. You realize what you've just told me, Brandt said quietly. You've made yourself the most valuable prisoner in the entire Reich, and also the most dangerous. I've made myself useful, Lucas corrected. My father taught me that usefulness is the only currency that matters when dealing with powerful men. And what do you propose to do with this usefulness? Lucas met his gaze directly. That depends on what you propose to do with Dr. Abramovich. Brandt laughed, a sound like winter wind through dead leaves. You're negotiating? A starving child in a concentration camp is trying to negotiate with me? I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. Dr. Abramovich lives and continues his work in the infirmary. In exchange, you have access to information that could make you indispensable to certain powerful individuals in Berlin, or make me a target for elimination, only if the information becomes public. As long as it remains controlled, private, shared only with those who have a vested interest in discretion, it becomes valuable intelligence rather than dangerous exposure. The commandant studied the boy with new respect. Beneath the starving exterior lay a mind trained in the subtle arts of power and negotiation. Karl von Stauffen had indeed prepared his son for survival in the most treacherous environments. You would trust me to honor such an arrangement? I would trust you to act in your own best interests, Lucas replied, which now include keeping me alive and cooperative. Brandt rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the camp. Below, the machinery of extermination continued its work. Guards counting prisoners, smoke rising from the crematoria, the endless cycle of death and disposal. But in his office sat a boy who had just transformed from victim to player in a game far larger than the petty brutalities of Gross Rosen. Very well, he said finally, turning back to face Lucas. Dr. Abramovich will be returned to his duties. You will be transferred to more appropriate accommodations, private quarters, adequate food, protection from the general population. And in exchange, you will provide me with detailed information about your father's network, names, activities, financial arrangements, everything you remember. Lucas nodded slowly. Within reason, some information is too dangerous to reveal all at once. It must be carefully managed. You're hardly in a position to set conditions. On the contrary, I'm in the only position that matters. I'm the sole possessor of information that powerful men will kill to protect or to obtain. That makes me valuable to you alive and cooperative, worthless to you dead or silent. The truth of this statement hung between them, like a sword balanced on a thread. Brandt was an experienced commander, accustomed to absolute power over life and death. But he was also a pragmatist who understood that some games required patience and subtlety. You'll be moved this afternoon, he decided. Officers' quarters, Block 1. Adequate rations, medical attention when needed. But make no mistake, you are still a prisoner. Your improved circumstances exist solely at my discretion. Understood. And the doctor will continue his work unmolested for as long as our arrangement remains mutually beneficial. Brandt nodded curtly and summoned his guards. As Lucas was escorted toward the door, the commandant called after him. One more thing, young von Stauffen. Your father's conspiracy failed. He died thinking he could change the course of history through noble sacrifice. Don't make the mistake of believing you can succeed where he failed. Lucas paused in the doorway, his gray eyes reflecting something that might have been pity. My father succeeded completely, he said quietly. He ensured that his son would survive to see the Reich fall, and we will. The door closed behind him, leaving Brandt alone with the implications of what had just transpired. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the camp, and somewhere in those shadows, the machinery of survival had just shifted in ways that would ripple far beyond the barbed wire of Gross Rosen. In the infirmary, Dr. Abramovich tended to his patients with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of unexpected reprieve. The noose marks around his neck would fade, but the memory of the boy who had risked everything to save him would remain forever. And in a clean room in the officers' quarters, Lucas von Stauffen sat on an actual bed with clean sheets, eating real bread and thinking about the delicate game he had set in motion. He was no longer just surviving. He was playing chess with the lives of some of the most powerful men in the Reich. The starving boy from the cattle car was gone. In his place sat a diplomat's son, trained from birth to navigate the treacherous waters of power and politics. The game had indeed just begun, and for the first time since his parents' death, Lucas allowed himself to believe he might actually win.